in Utrecht. And the reason that we asked her to speak to us tonight is because we're in this conversation about knowledge production. Of course, books are one of the kind of classical media in which knowledge is transmitted and can travel and reach different audiences in different languages. And it's kind of an interesting thing where when you have artists making books, because there are variations on the theme. Some artists theorize about their own work. In other words, they write essays about their work. And then you have the form of the artist's book, actually, a book as a work. So that's why we thought it would be interesting to hear about more about this collection and about Anna's work and thinking about books as objects versus artworks. And so I'll turn the time over to her, and then afterwards we'll have a chance again for some more questions and discussion.
For centuries, the book was considered one of the most important vehicles for transmitting knowledge or information. But in the 20th century, we see that this changes and that the book gets a new function in the context of art and art practices. You see that a radical new approach towards the traditional book appears in art practices at the avant-garde, so at the beginning of the 20th century. But that's not the first time that artists start experimenting with the book as a form, as a medium. If we look at the 18th and 19th century, we see already that a few creative spirits started experimenting with the book form. William Blake, as you can see here, one example of, was an English poet and writer. Can you hear me yet? Was an English poet and writer, and he can be seen as one of the first innovators in this field. Then we're talking about the 19th century, so at the second half of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century. In his expressive publications, he visualized his spiritual and imaginative thoughts, what made him highly unusual in his time. On the one hand, because he not only wrote the text for his publications, but he also illustrated themselves, and he made the illustrations and the text one. So it wasn't like it used to be a separation between text and image, but this was one of the first artists who starts integrating the two into a unity of text and of content and form. Besides that, he also is one of the first artists who started publishing his own publications. So he didn't work with an editor or with a publisher. He did it all in his own. He had it all in his own hands. Another poet who was of great importance for the development of the medium was Stéphane Mallarmé, the French poet and writer. He saw the concept of the book as an autonomous entity or structure, the book as metaphysical objects. He considered the relationship between form, language, and ideas a crucial problem for which he ought to seek a solution in his publications. In his works, he breaks with the classical book tradition in which words form sentences and sentences form a logical story. So what he does is that he doesn't use words to build up sentences and to make a logical story. He varies with them on the page, as you can see here in this example. By deconstructing sentences and arranging words in an unusual way, he neglected the traditional function of the book and entered the world of art. At the end of the 19th century, we witness a true renaissance of the book as an art form in England, under the influence of the arts and crafts movement. Artists like William Morris opposed to the industrialization and proposed a return to individual expressionism and craftsmanship. In the publications of artists like William Morris, text and image became also more of a unity, as you can see here. I think it's interesting to see how much these book forms were inspired by the Middle Age, the soteria from the Middle Ages. So here, if you see if you compare the two, you can see that in both forms the maker tries to unite text and image. So that's also one of the achievements of these early innovators in the fields of book arts. At the same time, we see in France that the livre d'artiste is coming up, and the livre d'artiste is also a book form in which the artist plays an important role. Most of the time, however, it is a collaboration between an artist, a publisher, an illustrator, and a writer. So the difference with the later artist books is that in this livres d'artiste, the artist only plays part of the role, only is responsible for a small part of the whole production of the book. So I think it's interesting to mention in this context because a lot of people confuse artist book with livre d'artiste, and the tradition of the livre d'artiste is very different from the artist book insofar that one, the artist isn't fully responsible for the whole production, but also that it's a type of book that is a result most of the time of commercial reasons. So an artist that has already a status in the art world is asked to make these kind of books because they can be sold for very, very high prices. And that's also why the livre d'artiste, parallel to the artist book, has a long tradition already in this 20th century modern art. But do remind that it is very different from the artist books that I will discuss later on. At the beginning of the 20th century, we see a real breakthrough in the genre when the Russian avant-garde start experimenting with the book as an art form. Artists such as Vladimir Klepnikov and Natalia Goncharova, who were active as well as artists as poets, have radical new approaches to the medium. They resent the aesthetical, lavishly decorated publications of the arts and crafts movement and of the tradition of the livre d'artiste, and display a new kind of approach to the book by introducing a form of aesthetic that is depending on cubism on the one hand and on Russian folk art on the other hand. So they break with the tradition of Western bookmaking. What we see here are a few aspects that became very important later in the artist book of the 60s and 70s. And it is that the artist is fully responsible for the content as well as the production and the distribution of the book. So they make the text, they make the illustrations, but they also do the binding, the printing, and the selling of the books. So here you see already that the book as a multiple, as an individual form of expression, is developing itself in many ways. What we see by the Russian avant-garde is that they have a big influence on the futurist and dadaist movements, and also on the constructivist publications and texts. And that's partly because what we see in avant-garde, in Russian avant-garde publications, is a lot of experimenting with typography. And that's something that also is very important in the way the futurists and the dadaists use the book as an art form. Marinetti, the spokesman of the futurists, was very proactive in using the book as an art form because he saw it as a modern medium. In his opinion, the modern world should reflect in every art form. The book was a way to use it because it didn't know any restrictions. The book as a medium was open to all kinds of contents. In his futuristic manifest, he reached interesting typographical experiments in which the traditional grammar and the standard format of letters and punctuation disappeared almost entirely. This again was of big influence on Dadaists like Tristan Tzara and Claude Switters, and constructivists such as Alice Lidsky, who lanced equal experiments. They discovered a way to shape their texts and poems in a way that they optically reflected their content. Again, the relationship between form and content became closer. In the 20s and 30s, we see also a lot of publications originate in the surrealistic movement, but what we see here is the same problem as with the livre artistes, is that a lot of surrealist artists did write text for the publications or did make illustrations, but weren't responsible for the publishing and the distribution of the books. So if you look at the first half of the 20th century, you can already say that a few of the most important features of the later artist books are eminent there. During the Second World War, the production of artist books stagnates from the end of the 30s until the 50s, so on. But after the Second World War, we see that a lot of experimental art movements start experimenting with the book again. And one of these art movements is the Koper movement in Denmark, in Belgium, and in the Netherlands. And the other one is the French letterists. And the French letterists, like Isidore Issou and Maurice Lemaitre, are using the book form and its ingredients, so words, letters, signs, to reach a visual effect, disregard their meaning. At the same time, artists who work in the field of experimental music, performance, and other non-traditional art forms are confiscating the medium. So what we see after the Second World War is that form and content become closer and closer. So in the whole process of confiscating the book within the art world, you see that there's always the attempt to bring content and form closer together. Although the book already played an important role in diverse art movements and disciplines in the first half of the 20th century, it is really discovered as an art form by artists in the 60s and 70s. In a period that is characterized by activism and a political and social call for innovation, art is the first form to innovate. As pop art and nouveau realism occupy a prominent place in the large museums, several innovating artists' initiatives develop themselves outside the official circuit. In reaction to the commercialization of art and an art world that places art on a pedestal, the need occurs to avoid the art world and dematerialize the art objects. Artists reject the traditional art forms and look for new ways to express themselves, in forms that doesn't manifest themselves through traditional art objects, but by actions, happenings, performance works, body arts, etc. These are all art forms that direct themselves to the public in a very one-to-one manner. So there's no intervenience by institutions, by commercialized parties or any of that kind. So there's a very direct approach to the public, and that's something that's also typical of the artist book. For artists who are looking for new forms of expression, the interest in the book as a medium is enormous. It was and is the perfect vehicle to express ideas and activities without depending on other parties. In addition, the medium is a relatively cheap way to distribute your ideas among a large public. Most of the time, the publications were offered for free or were sold for $2 or $3. So if you compare it to the prices that were already asked for real artworks like paintings and sculpture, there's a large difference. Next to the changes in the artistical climate of the time, there were also the technological innovations that played an important role in the development of the medium. In the 60s, we see a lot of new techniques like copying, Xerox and offset that made it possible for artists to produce very low budget products. So they were able to realize these kind of publications on their own without having any money. Pioneers as Diderot and Edward Richet used the book as an autonomous artistic medium. Diderot makes the conventions of the book, like binding and sequence, his foremost concern. His early experiments are the results of this research. It's a research after the physical form of the book. Richet's 26 gasoline stations is considered most of the time one of the first real artist book. It's an artist book I have here with me because it's also one of the first ones that were bought for the history, for the collection in the university in Utrecht. And what we see here also concerning knowledge production is that Richet photographed 26 gasoline stations, of course, along an American highway. And it's not as much the fact that he photographed the stations, but it's the way he gave an extra meaning to it by arranging it in a certain sequence. So what he does is that he creates a new kind of knowledge by his own alterations in something that already exists. So it's not more, later on you can come here and take a look, it's not more than only the 26 photographs with the titles of the stations that are in the book. Also, these kind of publications were sold for €3. And they were published in an edition of 400 copies. So that's also, I think, an important feature that is not unique anymore. They rejected the idea of the unique art object, and all these publications were published in a large edition. It didn't take long before an enormous flow of artist books and related publications appeared. Fluxus artists like George Manchunas, George Brecht, Alison Knowles and Robert Watts produced large amounts of printed matter, which occurred in limited editions and were sold for very low prices. Here's also one of the Fluxus publications. It's called Water Jam. It's made by George Brecht, and it was sold during that time for, say, about $5 American. Here is also, this also addresses the question of what consists of an artist's book. Is something like this, a box with some papers in it. Can it also be called a book? And can you see it in the tradition of bookmaking? Well, I think it is called a book because it has a certain sequence in the way you have to read it. So the papers that are in the box read like the pages from a book. So the form is not, and it could be in the 60s and 70s, the form of the book is not rigid. It's something which artists experiment with. In Brazil and Germany, the visual or concrete poets produced a lot of artist books. Like the futurists, Dadaists and Letterists, they operated at the intersection between typography, art and literature, with the goal to replace the traditional literal image by the typographical image. By shaping language and visual forms, they ought to reach unity between content and form. Dus ook in die periode na de Tweede Wereldoorlog. So also in the period after the Second World War, we see this urge to bring content and form closer together. I have an example here of a concrete artist book from concrete poetry from Emmett Williams, and there you see how that kind of poems are formed after their content. So I will show a few examples later on. For conceptual artists like Carl Andre, Stanley Brown, Joseph Kosuth, Lawrence Wiener and the Dutch artist Jan Lippitz, The book formed a convenient medium. Rebelling against the commercialization of art and the status of the unique art piece, these artists focused on the concept of the artwork instead of the physical form. The concept only became concrete in a text that was distributed by manifests and/or artist books. These were simple productions which focuses on the concept, so no luxurious books, but really, you can see it here later on, really sober, with cheap paper, most of the time no illustrations, to keep the production costs as low as possible. I think the project that Jan Dibbits, I will tell a little bit more about the project of Jan Dibbits because it's it's a good example of how these conceptual artists were working in the 60s and 70s. It was a project that he made for the Kröller Museum in Otterlo, and it's called Redbreast Territory Sculpture. It's also interesting in relation to the topic of today of concerning knowledge production, because what he did is that he made a concept for a work of art, and in this case it was what he wanted to do was to manipulate the territory that a bird makes for itself. So every bird has its own territory, and he wanted to manipulate the territory by placing certain poles in his natural surroundings. So he did a whole analysis of that process by making pictures in the museum park, by making sketches and everything. And he constructed an artwork around it that was called Redbreast Territory Sculpture. But what he didn't do was realize the artwork. And that was not because he intentionally wanted to, but because it was from the beginning on, it was the idea just to make the concept in his mind and to give a report of the concept in the form of an artist book, but never to realize it. And I think that's also interesting in relation to the topic of knowledge production, is that this is a whole new kind of knowledge production. It doesn't depend on an actual object. It doesn't depend on an actual result. It's something that's in the mind of the artist, and it can be transmitted in any form he or she chooses.
So he produced a book.
Yeah, he eventually produced the book, but there are a lot of conceptual artists who doesn't even present it in a concrete form. So they only present it through performances or through readings or something. But and if they already presented it in a concrete form, it was they most of the time chose for the artist book, because it still stands a long way off the art object as they knew it. So this was just to give an idea of all the possibilities concerning the artist book. If we take a look at the collection of artist books in the University of Utrecht, it's a perfect reflection of all the tendencies that were actual in the 60s and 70s. It dates completely from that period, so there are no artist books from the 80s and 90s in it, and also no from the 50s or 40s. As it dates from the 60s and 70s, it represents many of the artists and art movements that were active in this period. Responsible for the acquisition of the collection was Frans Haks, the former director of the Groningen Museum, and he worked at that time as a librarian in the university here in Utrecht. And it was very strange, because artist books were a kind of medium that were only circulating at that time in the underground art world. So they didn't occur already in official institutions like galleries or museums or libraries, etc. So it was very strange that he bought the books at the beginning of the 60s, Well, he had a good reason for it because he wanted that the modern art department here in Utrecht, which was very small at that moment, became more and more developed. And he was under the impression that when he started to collecting source material for students to work with, the interest in that kind of art would follow automatically. And that was also what happened. So we already had a large collection, I think about 50 books, at the beginning of the 60s. And he, of course, he also told students about it. And with that collection, they started the first work groups, say around 1966, which were concerned by the most recent art forms of that time. So in that case, it was a really innovative approach towards education, art education on the one hand, but also towards collecting these kind of books at the moment that they were just right off the press, so they weren't collected anywhere else at that moment. The artist book were beginning, and the availability of source material of modern and contemporary art contributed to the establishment of the Department of Modern Art, which was run by Karel Blotkamp. He's now a professor at the Vrije University in Amsterdam. And later also Frans Haks joined him as a tutor. Together they organized a large number of work groups, exhibitions, excursions and lectures focusing on the most recent art. The artist books played an important role in these discussions, so they were put on the table and they were used as direct source material, which is also interesting, I think, in the context of producing artistic knowledge. The books were acquired by the artists directly most of the time, and sometimes by galleries who were very focused on the most recent development in art. At first, the medium started off as an unknown phenomenon, but in the 70s this changes, and the artist book becomes a widely used medium. What we see is that in Europe and in the United States, a lot of underground institutes are formed in the 70s, and they're facilitating the production, the selling, the promotion, and also the distribution of artist books. Most of the times, these initiatives are run by the artists themselves, and that has two reasons. On the one hand, because it's a cheap way to institutionalize the art form, but on the other hand, to stay close in touch with it and don't let other parties interfere with the directness of the medium. Most of the time, these are artist initiatives that provide a platform for those who operate outside the official system. So Lewitt and Lucy Lippard started Printed Matter in New York, for example, and Martha Wilson started the Franklin Furness Archive, also in the United States. That was directed to the collecting, exhibition and distribution of artist books. In the Netherlands, HWA started Galerie A in Amsterdam, where also Art and Project was situated. And Art and Project was also kind of gallery initiative, where Haks and Blotkamp purchased a lot of their books in the 70s. Other initiatives originated at art schools and universities, like the one in Utrecht. It took till the end of the 70s still before the artist book became the subject of official exhibitions. So before that time, exhibitions were held in underground institutions, but at the end of the 70s, the art world as it was at that time was also beginning to pay attention to the artist book as an artistic medium. The final recognition of the genre came in 1977 when the Six Documenta in Kassel devoted a whole department to the subject. However, by that time, Haks and Blotkamp had already organized several exhibitions here in Utrecht. With their activities and the collection that they started here, The Art Historical Institute is the only university institution in Holland which collected artist books on such a large scale. The collection contains about 200 publications that reflect its the most important art movements of that time. So it's certainly worth a visit, because a lot of the time these artist books aren't part of exhibitions anymore, because we now live in an era wherein the art object is becoming more prominent again. So it's the artist book, the interest in the artist book from official institutions. I'm not talking about the interest from the artist side, but from official institutions is declining. So if you want to see a good collection of these kind of works, you certainly have to go to the library. The strange thing is, when I came there the first time, there were still some of the publications that just stood for loan in the department for students, so they could loan books by Lawrence Wiener, like his statements, for example. It's a book that's worth thousands of euros. They could loan it. There was a big sticker on it, and it was part of the whole museum system. So nobody did notice the collection for many years, and it was just until a few years ago that they became aware of the treasure that they were keeping in their university library. So as we look at the art form in general, but also at the collection in Utrecht, we can conclude that there is an enormous variety in this medium. Because of this variety, the opinions of what an artist book is, and I addressed it already earlier with the box of Robert Watson and Brecht, differ strongly. Johanna Drucker is an expert also in this medium, says the following thing about it. It's easy enough to state that an artist book is a book created as an original work of art, rather than a reproduction of a pre-existing work, and also that it is a book which integrates the formal means of its realization and production with its thematic or aesthetic issues. But this definition only raises more questions than it answers, and that's certainly the case. Can we only speak about an artist book if the artist is responsible for the content as well as the production of the publication? Must an artist book be limited to the book form, or are loose sheets, rolls, tablets and book objects also included? Because a lot of artists, especially in the 60s and 70s, didn't restrain themselves to the book form. That was an essential aspect of the medium, that they also started to experiment with the book form themselves. So if you exclude book objects or maps with loose sheets, you already disregard the intention of the artists who are active in this field. An independent spirit forms the characteristic of the medium, and it is exactly the variety that makes this an interesting phenomenon. Artists make use of all kinds of books. I will show them a few here in the presentation. From comic book to flip book, pop-up book to postcard book, the format of these publications vary from 2 centimeters to a meter. Most of the artists make use of the traditional book form, but within this form they experiment with all possible materials and techniques. This is for example, what we call a leporello. It's a book that is in which the pages are binded as one, so you can only read it if you flip it out. The pages of the book can consist of cotton, metal, wood and glass, and the materials which they use differ from paint and ink to ink to milk and blood. This is an example of what we call one of the border activities in the medium. It's made by Christian Boltanski, who made a lot of traditional artist books also in the book form. I have one with me here, so I can show it later on. But he also made a large amount of maps in which he did put different material, which you see also in the books, but with a concept that is very similar with the concept of the book. So that's why when I did the research after this collection of artist book, I didn't exclude these kind of objects, because in my opinion they are just what makes the artist book a free medium. And when you're going to make it, how can I say it? When you will exclude this kind of booklets, you do short to the artist, as I mentioned earlier. The techniques that are used can differ also from pen and ink to Xerox. Then there are the artist books that appear in an edition and the artist books that appear as a unique art form. The makers of these artist books don't only work within any kind of form and production method, they also participate in every possible ism that there is in the world of art. Johanna Drucker says in this context, if all the various elements or activities which contribute to artist books as a field are described, what emerges is a space made by their intersection, one which is a zone of activity rather than a category into which to place works by evaluating whether they meet or fail to meet the certain rigid criteria. And indeed, the medium results from fine printing, independent publishing, the craft tradition of book arts, painting and other traditional art, but also from political motivated art movements, performance art, concrete poetry, experimental music and film, computer and electronic arts. And there we come to one of the most important characteristics of this medium, and that is its interdisciplinarity. And I think that's also why it's interesting to talk about this subject in the context of this seminar. Most of the artists who use this medium come from different fields. So it's not the case that only visual artists work with artist books. A lot of musicians work with the medium also, a lot of filmmakers, a lot of poets. So the practice is very varied. It's a zone that is in itself interdisciplinary because you can use it for different art forms. It's a very open medium, but it's also used by a lot of different artists. So on both sides it's interdisciplinary. Today the artistical boundaries become more and more vaguely, as Maria already pointed out. Eventually they will possibly disappear. They rely on other disciplines and field of knowledge, work together with external specialists and use a large variety of media. The work of these artists contains different influences and ideas and therefore address a broad audience. And that is exactly what determines the artist book and why it is such a popular medium nowadays. For artists who work in different art fields, a medium like the book is something they need also to free themselves from the rigid borders of every discipline. That is exactly also what determines the artist book and why it's such a popular medium nowadays. Because the independency of the medium, the artist book maker doesn't have to deal with the rigid rules of a lot of other disciplines and gets the opportunity to transfer knowledge in a direct, personal way. Books serve to extend the possibility of visual arts, architecture, performance, music, poetry, and literature. By deconstructing, reconstruction, and appropriation of other disciplines and fields of knowledge, the artist disregards their boundaries and develops new forms of knowledge for which the book is the perfect vehicle. So where the book, since the Middle Ages, has been considered the major medium for transmitting knowledge, the use of the book by contemporary artists plays an active part in their practices and contributes to a specific production and circulation of artistic knowledge. This is closely related to another essential feature of the medium, the importance of its conceptual content, which concerning the artist's book is unmistakably related to its form, as we saw already in the history that I did point out earlier. So on the one hand, we have the importance of the interdisciplinarity in this medium. On the other hand, the importance of the concept. I think the artists started to use the medium because they could project any concept they wanted in it. It became a kind of second space. It became a conceptual space which they could fill in any way they wanted. A good example of this is this book. It's very famous. It's by Marcel Groothuis. I have it with me also, so we can see it later. And here also you see how an artist can produce a new kind of knowledge by making alterations in something that already exists. It's the book is based on the book that I showed you earlier by Mallarmé. And what Groothuis did is that he exchanged the words that Mallarmé put into the book by forms. So this is in this concept what I was talking about earlier, the bringing together of content and form is something that got really concrete in this example. So this is one of the I think most clear examples of a practice where form and content become closer and closer, and eventually, in this case, become one. Much artist work is like that of Groothuis, artistically, politically, or socially motivated in its theme, and frequently they turn to the inexpensive multiple as a means of addressing these topics to a wider audience. Books, because they have the capacity to circulate freely, are not depending on institutional restraints. They are low maintenance, relatively long-lived, free-floating objects with the capacity to convey a great deal of information and serve as a vehicle to communicate far beyond the limits of any unique art piece. From the Russian futurists to the Fluxus artists to the artists that practice art nowadays, the idea of making the book a tool of independent activist thought and knowledge has been one of the persistent elements of the mystique around the artist's book. So the artist's book, I think the core of the genre is its independency, and that's why it's so popular in periods where artists want to make themselves free from restraints in any sense. And what we see in the 60s and in the 70s is a tendency that is very lively nowadays also, and I think that's why we see a lot of young artists, especially within the art academies in the Netherlands, but also internationally, use the medium as a form of artistic expression. So that was in the introduction on the subject. I don't know if there are any questions so far. If everybody has an idea of the difference between the traditional book as we knew it and the artist book as it is produced nowadays. It's difficult to give a definition of the genre, and I don't think it's appropriate either to do it, as I explained earlier. But I think this will give an idea of the scope of the medium. I here have a few of the artist books from the collection in Utrecht. As I told earlier, there are all from the 60s and 70s. Thus the important art movements from that day on are the Fluxus movement, conceptual art, concrete poetry, performance art, body art, etc. I did bring a few examples in which language and knowledge plays an important role, and that are most of the times the conceptual books, like the books by Stanley Brown, for example. I have it here with me. Stanley Brown is also an example of an artist who works from the concept, and what he does is that in his artist books is that he sometimes they are in the form of a catalog, so they are a kind of registration from one of his projects. But sometimes also the project, like the project of Dibbets, was never realized, and it just and it only becomes concrete in the book that he published about it. It's here on the table. There's also a book from Solowit. It's called Lines and Colors. This is an example in which language doesn't play an important role. It's only as the title says, it's only colors and lines. But it's interesting to see how this also is the art object itself. So there is no artwork anywhere with this title and this concept. It only got form in the artist book as we have it here. So maybe it's interesting to come forward and see a few of the publications, or
maybe first,
yeah.
I maybe should ask a question. We at Zwaag in a number of projects explore the phenomena of artists' writings, and I wonder whether there's, through your research, you found any relationship between artists' writings and artists' books. From your introduction, it doesn't seem to be in any way related, actually.
Now you mean what kind of project did you do in this context?
We published a book 2 years ago in 2004 that was called Now What Artists Write, and we explored the genre of artist writings there. So writings that go beyond the description of your own work, but that has both theoretical and poetic ambition by the artist.
And Williams, a concrete poet, it's not only his texts that are in the book, because then it would be a normal book of a poet, but it is what he does with the text, is the way in which he transforms it into this specific medium. So I think that's an important question in relation to the artist book, in which way the artist gives this extra attention to the book as an art form. So in which way it's not only about textual content, and there has to be a close relationship between form and content. But I saw one of the publications from Mariana, which she published.
Just this one.
Yeah, it's this one. And there you see also that it's the content, but also a very clear choice of opinion about how the book has to be formed. So it's not a normal book you can buy in bookstores, and that's, I think, important here.
So I just, when artists do a book as a medium, and they formalize that book so that it fit to their content or to your content and form. There is a specific approach in terms of dematerialization and then performance. So, like actually, the one image you show, the book produced in 2005, for me that's kind of very against like conceptual approach to the book, which play a very important role in artist book production, because that has very heavy materiality.
Yes. I have to look at it. This one is really Yeah, but sometimes it's difficult to
Find the boundaries.
to find the boundaries in this, because here what the artist does is explore the characteristic of the book as an object. So what are the boundaries of the book? It isn't so much about content anymore; it's about form. But a lot of artists, book makers, and not as much in the 60s and 70s, because then content was the most crucial point. But later on, especially in the 80s and 90s, a lot of artists also experimented with the book as a form. So they made books in marble, they made books in glass, they made all kinds of book objects.
Then, but it became more like object for the piece.
Yeah.
Tour for
Yeah,
playing or performing.
Yeah.
Using fluxes really use as a
Yes.
tour or a tool.
Yes. But it's also, I think, also depending on the period in which the books are originated. If you look at the artist book production through the years, you can see how much it is an expression of what we call the tijdgeest, of the zeitgeist. Yeah, because here it's an underground art form that artists needed to get away from the official system. But if we look at the 80s and 90s, you see that the artist book as an art form is more and more being cultivated, and it becomes there's a tendency towards the livre d'artiste, towards a more luxurious, elaborate artwork. But nowadays you see that there's a tendency back to these kind of indications, and I think it has a lot to do with the art world as it is nowadays.
Also with this book you think of even older forms like sketchbook, drawings,
Yeah, exactly.
It's
Yeah.
also that
Yeah.
line.
So it's difficult to say what can we call the artist book, because a lot of these books are made also by well-known artists. But I think an important, as I see it personally, is that an important feature of the artist book, as I researched it, was its underground status. And I think that's particularly interesting at this moment, is that young artists use it again as a medium for experiment and for independence. And there's a relationship in what they did in the 60s and 70s. It was long gone in the 80s and 90s. I think also because in the 80s and 90s you saw that with the computer technologies and everything that was, all the possibilities that artists had, they used it fully. So there was an enormous drive to use in the artist book all kinds of modern techniques, and the simple book as it was became less and less available. And what we see now, I think, is that because of the enormous amounts of possibilities, young artists tend to go back to the simple forms of communication.
But very different than a catalog. You have to elaborate on the big difference with a catalog.
Yeah, well, that's also an important problem in the whole artist book discussion, is that there are, in the 60s, it started in the 60s already with catalogs who were made by artists, who were also published in a small edition, say in thousand copies. If you think about the museum Mönchengladbach, I don't know if you know, it's a museum in Germany, just around the border. They published a lot of artist book-like catalogs that became also very valuable later on, because it was in a small edition. It was made by an artist. But the important difference is it wasn't made as an artwork, as an autonomous artwork. It was still a registration of an exhibition, of something more important outside the book. And that's the difference with these kind of books. The book is the thing, is the object.
But you have mixed forms.
Yeah, of course, it's difficult. You always have mixed form. There are also artists who publish artist books that are related to a special exhibition. If you look at this book from Boltanski, it contains an inventory of photographs he made from a woman that was living in the town where he was exhibiting. So what he did is that in every town where he exhibited his artworks, he made these kind of inventories. But so there's a close relationship with, and they were sold also the books with the exhibition. But the difference is that it isn't a catalog. It's something that stands in itself.
This is another example. Right? It's Lonnie's book.
Yes.
And
yes.
it's from this one that the text was read out, right?
No, it's
It's from a new one.
It's from a new
Which
but actually every of your work has this dimension as well. Huh? You
Yeah.
publish this. You
And
design it yourself, you write the text.
And maybe I can tell a little about the reason why I started designing my own books.
Yeah.
It was when I was, it's like a few years ago, I was in an editorial group. It was called Millennium, and we published a magazine. We were working with graphical designers, and what happened was I was in the editorial team, and we were with several people, and I would ask other artists to contribute, and then the graphical designers would make the layout and things like that. But the graphical designers, they only came up always, they were the design police, quite famous, but they would come up with the idea of how to make the book only at the very end. So we had to approach all the artists, and then when we collected the material, they could say like, oh, we're going to publish everything
Yeah.
black and white, or or photocopy quality. And I really, and also they did like very, when they work with text, they would decide like we do everything in capitals and leave away the dots. So and this is, in my opinion, happening quite often, especially when artists make books with graphical design. So I decided to do it myself and do it in a very simple way.
And do you see them as artist books?
Yes, I do, because I do everything. So, everything.
And how do you distribute? Because distribution from what
Yeah, well, that's also typical for the artist book. I think that's an important it's important aspect. So when the artist is responsible for the whole, for the content as well as the form, as well as production and distribution, then you can call it an artist book. And that's also the difference with exhibition catalogs. They are most of the time distributed by the museums or the galleries, even though they're made by artists.
But you have a lot of graphic designers that make artist books as well.
Yeah, yeah. But also that was already the case in the 60s. If you look at a certain project from Anton Beke, for example, they are also in the collection of the Utrecht library because they were considered artist books in that time. So there was also Hilversum steenwikkerij. Well, it's very specialized, but they did a lot of projects with graphic designers that were also stated as artist books. So it wasn't, and you see a lot of fashion designers also work with the medium. And I think that's important, that it isn't restricted to visual artists only. It's used by graphic designers.
Because I ask this, my master students, they collaborate with graphic designers, and that's typography, that they collaborate. So I'm interested in what you're saying, that you skip the graphic designers and then it became an artist group. And I think in collaboration, well, when I see the way how the graphic designers approach it, is
similar.
It's very similar.
Yeah.
It's really very similar.
Yeah.
And they will just
Lonnie makes the artist book not in a formal way, but as a way to communicate something. Not a formal thing. It has to look, have a lot of visual things you want to tell your story.
Yeah.
And that's why you took it away from the graphic design or the formal side of it.
Yeah.
So you try to do something totally different than what most classic artist book manufacturers.
That's why I was also very interested in your question. I was also curious if there would be, because for me it's really a autonomous platform. I really like it as that. And I could imagine that there were more artists who like to publish their text in a publication they made themselves.
Yeah, but I think when I look at your work, then it is an artist book because and I think that's the difference. If you have text from artists who are published by a publisher or designed graphically designed by an outsider, then it's not an artist book anymore. But when the whole concept, and there you see again the importance of the concept in this discussion, when the whole concept is in the hands of the artist, then you can speak about an artist book. I think that's also something, what I saw in your work, is that the concept is more and more important, maybe more important than the final results. And that's also, I think, a similarity with this kind of production. Because I think it's in line with what the artists were doing in the 60s and 70s, yes. But there's a difference when other parties intervene in the process. At the moment that happens, then the artist doesn't have its autonomy anymore. And then it's not an autonomous product anymore.
But what I sometimes hear from graphic designers is that they find that if they have to, for example, when they're producing catalogs together with the artist, there's no graphic designer. They say that the artists tend to be very conservative and want very clear design with readable text, and that these days the graphic designers have become the adventurous people who really want to do a lot of things. So that's a very funny contrast. I think that has
It connects.
Yeah, but it also creates a conflict because it's the graphic designer wants to operate more and more autonomous. And the artist wants to do the same thing, and that's why a lot of artists choose again to and that was different in this time, because then the graphic designer wasn't as much as an artistic spirit as it is nowadays. So it's, I think, something that leads to conflicts. And it's interesting that you mentioned it. It's something you want to keep a hold on in your own practice.
So it's also something that started to change only in the 60s, where before the 60s, like what we now call graphic design, which has its own sort of artistic, aesthetic label, that was advertising. You were an ad man.
Yes.
And actually, when you see Andy Warhol sort of playing with what were corporate advertisements, candles and these kind of iconic things, I think it's only then that artists actually start to play with that shift a bit. But it's true that certainly more and more graphic designers also see themselves as artists, so they would imagine that they would have more of a creative input instead of, in a sense, you being the creator and author of the publication and asking them to do sort of whatever's in their expertise realm, and not as like a collaborator or co-producer. So that, I think that also comes out of this expansion of graphic design.
But it's not only graphic design, it's also, for example, now they show in the State Museum, and then the curator has sort of this plan how to paint the walls, for example, so that we have a gray room, and it's not to be discussed. It's like, for example, if you go to the Central Museum here in Utrecht, we also have a lot of design items in the spaces. So creativity is kind of moving up. And as an artist, you have to somehow relate to that. I find it sometimes very problematic.
Yeah, but I think.
Why I like that.
Yeah, and that's why. But that's also the same. In that period, artists also wanted to make themselves free of the art world and its restrictions. And I think that's something that's very. That you see a lot these times also. There's a lot of outside pressure, and then you see artists become more and more individual and autonomous again.
You have to come in defense of curators.
What you said about the catalog is interesting, because you have the same problem with the magazine. There are also a lot of magazines now produced who are made by artists and who function also in some kind of the artist group. And you saw it already in the 60s, because you had then a magazine called Decollage, and also Aspen magazine that was made by Andy Warhol and other artists from the United States. And these magazines are also in collection in Utrecht because of the same problem, because it's more difficult to say, well, what is an artist and what isn't. But to come back at the topic, I think important is, and it's interesting that was also the reason that Frans Hals collected these kind of items. It's that he saw it as source material. So it was a kind of way to get an insight into the mind of the artist. And it isn't at the moment when another party is designing a book and yet another is publishing a book. But when you're talking about your practice, if someone sees your publications, you can say, well, it's content-wise, but also in form, it reflects her artistic vision.
Yeah, but I still don't agree because I think you can also collaborate and still make an artist group. You can collaborate with a graphic designer. It really depends on.
Yeah, of course, it depends on the role, on the roles that you have.
You can even deliberately try to make a very small publication and try to have it published by a very large editor as a kind of concept.
You see it happening with Rails, the railway company magazine now, which issues very small extra magazines which have a very limited number of copies, which you can order for prices ranging from, I believe, 50 cents to 200 euros or something, depending on what it is and how many are made. And you have to order them separately on the internet. And that's artists. I don't really know if it's just the magazine editors themselves which do it as a sort of commercial thing with an artistic sideline about it, or it's actually artists who will have infiltrated in Rails and made it something for themselves. But it's weird.
Well, what an interesting anecdote is in this context is that in the collection you have to, if you look at what Karel Boskamp and Frans Hart did at university, it was very rebellious because it was an institute that was focused merely on 16, 17 art, iconology. So modern art didn't really have a place within the institute. And they forced it in with acquiring such kind of material and giving the lectures and everything. But as you saw that time that the other people who teach the institute or professors were very much against it because they were saying, well, why is there going any money into this kind of? It isn't even an art object. It isn't even available. So all the cliches that these artists were addressing were at that moment at the institute were common. But interesting is that there was one professor who was that annoyed so much by the practice of these two gentlemen that he made an artist book himself and put it into the collection. And then for years it wasn't clear if it was an artist book. So nobody noticed it even. He just made it and he based it. It was someone who was specialized in the 15th century. But he was so annoyed by the whole artist book practice that he just made one and put it into the library. And it circulated in the lectures and everything for many years. So it's just an example to show.
How do you consider the fact that now these books have become very valuable collector's items?
Yeah,
that's a strange.
That goes totally against the intention of the books. That of course, yeah. But if you, I think that's something that's in the, that's the circle of art. I can call it because it's something. Every big artist starts small as being avant-garde. If you look at the works of the Russian avant-garde, they are also started as rebellious.
Today you can print books from the internet. You can publish a book on the internet. You can print it, and then they stop.
Yeah. But I think now the thing is with these kind of books is that when the artist made them, they weren't so famous at all, and they became more and more. They got more and more of a status during the years. And now every work from Boltanski or from Solowit is worth a lot of money. So, but it's really in conflict with the original intention.
But what I was aiming more for was the question if artists are artists aware of it? Artists must be aware of it now that books can also become collector's items, etc. And I mean, the internet is now producing ways of escaping that. You can So
Yeah, of
you can
course.
now
It's,
find other
yes,
ways.
yes, it's a new way. Well, as you can see, in the 60s, the use of photocopy, Xerox, etc., the very cheap production methods was also a way to escape from luxurious and valuable livre d'artiste. And now you see the internet is the same kind of escape. So yeah, I don't know how long the artist will stay when you have a medium like the internet.
Well, I think it will definitely stay.
Yeah.
I've made books for, well, as long as I've lived probably. Artist books, comic books, everything. For me, the lure of making a book, the love of the book as a thing, and the way that it conveys a tactile thing that
Yes.
comes with the reading or the looking or whatever it is something which the internet doesn't give you.
Well, it can give it to the audience. If people can print things from the internet, they
Yeah, but
there are new options.
Yeah, there are definitely new options. There's besides the fact that computers make printing even easier than they were in the 60s and 70s. It's also a way to gain an audience, to sell your books with a low effort. There's definitely a lot of ways to go between both of them.
Wasn't it actually, I don't remember, was it TIU who published a book on the internet which you could also buy in the store, and then it was really expensive, but from the internet?
I know Jens Haning published his own catalog, which you could download for free.
It's also playing with the system of Zwaag.
But then it's also important what's more crucial, the concept. If it's only the content of the book, it doesn't matter in what form you transmit it to your audience. It can be internet, it can be anything. But if you consider the book, the content and the form and unity, then it becomes important to have the object as an actual tactile product.
But maybe you could also say that the one that you produce from the internet, that maybe it's an artist book, then when you buy it in the store.
Yeah.
If you download it from the internet, you're probably closer to the artist's wishes.
Well, that's also something
Yeah.
to recognize. What was the intention?
Shall we have a look at the books? And thank you very much for such exciting presentation. Thank you for the discussion.